and welcome to the Pod Like a Pro podcast.
This is the podcast that gives you tips, tricks, and personal experiences so you can podcast like the professionals.
I'm Liz.
And I'm Nat.
And we are from Pod and Pen Productions.
And we'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal people from whose land we are recording this episode on.
Now today we are answering a listener question from Kate in Umina. Many people who listen to this podcast may know Kate in Umina. She has a wonderful bookstore there. So she has a really good question, I think. What is it, Nat?
What is the ideal length for a podcast?
Yeah, such a good question because it's really actually hard to know that, in that it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string, but I have a good answer. It's a one sentence answer and it is, are you ready for it?
Yeah.
As long as it needs to be and not a minute longer. Is that helpful?
It's extremely helpful because, I mean, it's you think of the time that people have these days to invest in things, and it just seems like the world's speeding up and everyone's running out of time. So does anyone have that extra minute to spare, really, in the way that most people live their lives? I mean, yeah, just don't make it any longer than it needs to be, I think is really the answer to that question. But there's many other aspects to this as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there absolutely is. So what I actually really mean when I'm saying as long as it needs to be is how long do you need to actually, like if you have a premise, if you have an idea of what you're actually trying to get across, you've got either you're talking to somebody or you're talking by yourself and you've got this idea of what that story is, then tell that story, but don't start waffling into something else. You know, a lot of people do get a little bit sidetracked along the way, but if we have a really clear idea of what we're actually doing with that person, what we're there for that episode, then we're less likely to go off on those tangents. And it's just giving your listener, your audience, a really clear idea of we're talking about this on this episode, and that's what we're talking about on this episode. And so you're giving them actually what you're telling them you're going to give them, which is actually great because you're not wasting anyone's time. And I think there is a lot of people that do tend to take a while to get into the podcast and then also keep it going a little bit longer than what is ideal. And so it's those 2 points at the beginning and at the end especially that I think a lot of people in general, in a kind and loving way, could listen back and go, is this actually talking to what I said I was going to do for this? Is this part of the purpose of this episode?
Yeah, because, you know, what people did on the weekend and what they're doing for the next holiday is not kind of the information that people are coming for. I mean, I think some people think, oh, well, you know, it's chatty and it's interesting. But no, I really agree that you really just need to stick to what you've actually said that you're going to do and not really go anywhere else off the track. Now,
we do actually have some data to back this up as well. From PodPol24, who we are speaking to Kelly Reardon from Dead Set Studios for an episode of this podcast. So you'll be able to find out more about PodPol24 in a later episode. But for the purposes of today's question around length, they did ask a whole bunch of Australian podcast listeners what is their preferred episode length? Now, again, I feel like this sort of backs up my answer of as long as it needs to be because the answer is between 15 and 60 minutes. That is what the majority said. So 43% said 15 to 30 minutes, 51% said 30 to 60 minutes. Importantly, 42% said they rarely or never listen to a podcast longer than 60 minutes. So 60 minutes, I think for us regular folk who are making podcasts who are not Diary of CEO types, 60 minutes is the cutoff. 15, minutes might be the starting point, and it's somewhere in there. How long does it take to tell your story in that time frame?
And I noticed there, Liz, that there's really no ones in those numbers. You know, it's not 61 minutes. It's not 31 minutes. It's, that extra minute isn't there. And I think it really also goes back to knowing your audience and knowing their patterns of behavior, knowing how far they might be driving or when they might be listening to actually tailor your episodes to that time so people can fit your podcast into their day and not have to fit their day around your podcast.
Yeah, and that probably speaks to the idea of consistency as well, doesn't it?
Yes. It's really important to be consistent so people know what they're going to get when they hit play on your podcast. Because if you usually do episodes that are 60 minutes long or 30 minutes long, then that's what they're going to expect. So if you do one that's an hour and a half, they might go, oh gee, that doesn't fit into my day today, and they might not come back to listen again, or they might not finish that episode. So they're missing out on what you're wanting to share with them.
Yeah, and so I think the message there is to be consistent so that, again, you're serving your audience, you're serving your listeners. So you're not waffling, you're telling them what you're going to talk about, and then you talk about it, and you are serving them by making sure that you are staying within the timeframes that you've basically set up those expectations that, I have a 20-minute podcast, so therefore my podcast is going to be 20 minutes or thereabouts. I think a 5-minute buffer either way is fine, and I don't think anyone's going to complain about that. And it's also totally fine to have a shorter episode where maybe you talk to by yourself and then have a longer episode with a guest. But again, it's just setting up those expectations. Explain to people, this is how my podcast works. And if you do have something amazing that happens and you have this hour-long interview and you just can't cut any of it, then explain to people, I've done this interview, it's so great that either I'm going to play it out for an hour, it's a special episode, maybe give people a warning in this episode beforehand, or cut it up into 2 episodes and have 2 parts. Do it like that, but make sure you're putting the listener first so they know what's happening. Don't just send it out there and pretend like it's the same as all the other ones, because if you start doing that, people will feel like they're not being considered.
I really like the idea of, if you've got something that's super interesting and super rich and a great guest, I think that the cutting it up into different episodes is a really great way to do it, because it also saves you time as well, because that's another episode that you don't have to record. And I think the thing with length that I feel is something to consider is that, say you have somebody who has a longer commute, they've got an hour, but your episodes are only half an hour, they can actually listen to 2 episodes back to back if they're really into your content as well. It's also better for your numbers as well, because you've got people who are listening to more episodes, which are going to, I mean, not that we say live and die by the numbers, but that's just another thing to consider.
And the other thing that you mentioned there was editing, which is also a really important part to consider. The more you record, the more you've got to edit and think about that, the harder it is to control the story. And especially if you're trying to do a 20-minute podcast, but you record 40 minutes, you are creating a rod for your own back that is just going to make your podcast unsustainable. You're going to give up, because the editing to cut that down into 20 minutes is going to be so painful. So record the amount of time that you want your podcast, the length to be. And so you're really just cutting out small amounts if you need to, where there are little, moments where people do something and you've got to cut that bit out, and that's totally fine. But you don't want to be setting something up where you are really changing the whole structure of what's been recorded.
And it's really, as you said, Liz, it's really in your planning, in knowing what you're wanting to do. That's the key, because that's going to keep you on track, which is going to keep you on time and keep you out of hours and hours and hours of editing, which no one likes to do.
Nobody likes to do. So with all of that in mind, I feel like we come back to where we started, which is the podcast needs to be as long as it needs to be and not a minute longer. So I feel like, lawyers say it depends. Like the lawyer, the joke is that the answer to something is it depends. I feel like that's the podcast answer, as long as it needs to be. So sorry, that's not very clear, but I hope that in some of what we've said there, we've cleared it up a little.
Oh yeah, I think it's clear. I think don't be boring, keep on track, and don't go a minute over than you need to. And with that, Liz, I'm just looking at the time, so we better wrap this up.
Okay, thank you for listening to Pod Like a Pro today. If you'd like to know about how you can sound more professional in your podcast, you can head to our website, which is
podandpen.com.au. And we don't just launch podcasts, we also help established podcasters with audits and consultations as well. So if you're looking for ways to improve on that great job you've already been doing, get in touch.
And for now, happy listening.